David Parker, a black hotel owner, was thrown out of his own establishment, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. The staff judged him based solely on his appearance, deciding whether he belonged there or not, without knowing the twist that would change their lives and shake the very system that allowed such injustice to thrive. When the truth was revealed, it would not only alter their fate, but also shake the foundation of the discrimination they upheld. What happens next will surprise even those who think they have seen it all. Watch the story unfold and join the fight against systemic bias and injustice. If you enjoy these inspiring and captivating stories, please subscribe and hit the like button. Every action you take brings us closer to meaningful change. David Parker stood in front of his hotel. Today, instead of relying solely on reports, he decided to check firsthand how his staff behaved. Remaining incognito was crucial for him, as it allowed him to see the true picture. The hotel looked flawless. The marble floors gleamed, the chandeliers sparkled, and the reception staff appeared highly professional. But David knew that appearances didn't always reflect reality. He dressed in simple clothes, jeans, and a jacket, with nothing that would indicate his status. To most people, David would look just like any ordinary guest. And that was exactly what he wanted. It gave him a chance to observe how the staff treated guests without being noticed. At first glance, everything in the lobby seemed peaceful, but David couldn't shake off a sense of unease. His eyes scanned the room, stopping at various areas where employees were working, while his hand unconsciously gripped the handle of his bag. He walked to the reception desk, his steps slow but steady. Jake, the young staff member standing at the counter, didn't bother to look up as David approached. David stopped, standing directly in front of Jake, waiting for a greeting. The air felt still, with only the sound of keyboards clicking somewhere nearby. David leaned in slightly, raising an eyebrow, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, Jake reluctantly looked up, his eyes briefly glancing over David, an annoyed expression crossing his face, his lips curving as if disturbed. "How can I help you?" The voice was flat, devoid of any friendliness. David sensed the change in the atmosphere. Jake looked at him, evaluating him, but not based on anything other than his attire. David straightened up, keeping his breath steady, and asked about room availability. He already knew the answer, but he wanted to see how Jake would respond. Jake glanced at the computer screen, his fingers moving carelessly over the keys. "Sorry, all rooms are booked," Jake said curtly, and immediately turned to speak with another staff member, as if David had vanished. David felt a surge of heat rush through him, but he kept his hands firmly clenched, avoiding any visible reaction. He knew this scenario well. The simple clothes he wore had instantly put him in the undesirable category. He knew this wasn't a coincidence, and he decided not to leave. David stayed his ground, his feet rooted firmly to the floor, ignoring the cold reception from Jake. His lips pressed tightly together, his gaze fixed on Jake. He wanted to see just how far this prejudice would go. David took a deep breath and continued his request. "Can you please check my reservation? I booked it in advance." Jake furrowed his brow, exhaling a long sigh, his eyes betraying his irritation. He turned back to the screen, his fingers tapping a few keys with obvious reluctance. Each of Jake's movements was quick and careless, his head bent slightly, avoiding eye contact with David. After a while, Jake stopped, smirked faintly, and said, "Sorry, I don't see any reservation under your name." His tone was indifferent, laced with contempt, as if to say, "Go somewhere else." David felt his body tense, his fists clenching, though his expression remained calm. He stood straight, eyes fixed on Jake. Jake's brow furrowed, and his lips twisted into an openly disdainful smirk. David refused to back down. He leaned in slightly, his voice soft but clear. "Could you check my reservation again?" Jake rolled his eyes, exhaled loudly, and turned away with an exaggerated shrug. Emily, another staff member, overheard the conversation, glanced at David, and stepped over, leaning in to whisper something in Jake's ear before stepping back, her arms folding across her chest. "Maybe we should just kick him out," she said, loud enough for David to hear. David felt his heartbeat quicken, his fists clenching tighter, but his face remained neutral. He caught Emily's gaze, cold and utterly indifferent. Jake turned back to face David, his eyebrows easing, though the sneer remained. I already told you, we don't have any rooms for you. Maybe you should find someplace else to stay, Jake said, shrugging dismissively. He stood there, his arms folded tightly, his eyes no longer carrying the politeness of a receptionist, but the look of someone who wanted David out. The air grew heavy and still, Jake's words hanging in the silence. David felt heat rising in his chest, his breath becoming uneven. He looked directly into Jake's eyes, his gaze filled with both anger and determination. Jake didn't avert his eyes, his gaze remaining steady, filled with blatant disdain. David remained motionless for a moment, then slowly exhaled, trying to regain control of his emotions. His father's words echoed in his mind. You have to work twice as hard and be twice as good because this world won't see your abilities, it will see your skin color. His father had not only said those words but lived by them. He had taught David that respect must be earned, even when the system refused to grant it. But each time David found himself in a situation like this, it felt as though all those efforts were being dismissed. David took a deep breath, his shoulders slowly relaxing. He looked down, considering briefly whether this was the time to confront or just walk away. He looked around, the gleaming lobby, customers walking by, and Jake and Emily still waiting. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he decided to stand his ground, his hands slowly unclenching, falling loosely by his sides. David also thought about the other guests who might have faced similar treatment, those who didn't have the strength to defend themselves as he did. He looked directly at Jake and Emily. The tension was no longer just a feeling, it was evident in Jake's fidgeting, the anxious glint in his eyes. David could clearly see the weariness and indifference in their faces. Jake, losing his patience, glanced at Emily for support, then crossed his arms over his chest, speaking with irritation. I've already told you, there's no room for you. I don't understand why you can't get that, but you need to leave. Jake gritted his teeth, his voice harsh, his eyes full of intent to force David out immediately. Melise sensed the tension rising, stepped closer, and lowered her voice, but it was still loud enough for others to hear. Maybe we should call security. We don't have time for problems like this. The word problems hung in the air like an accusation. David tilted his head slightly, his eyes fixed on Emily and Jake. It was clear they didn't want him there. He raised an eyebrow, giving them a calm, steady look. On the outside, he maintained a composed facade, but inside, his chest rose and fell heavily, his jaw clenched. This was not the time to back down. He decided to let the situation play out a little further, to see just how far their prejudice would go. Jake nodded at Emily, and she immediately turned away, picking up the phone to call security without a second thought. A few minutes later, two tall security guards in uniform entered the lobby. Their presence instantly heightened the tension in the room. One of the guards, broad-shouldered and tall, walked straight towards David with determined steps. He stopped in front of David, looking him directly in the eyes without saying anything, and stated, "Sir, you've been asked to leave the hotel. We'll escort you out." David stared back at the guard, his hands hanging loosely by his sides, palms beginning to sweat. He realized that the situation was quickly turning into a confrontation. These guards weren't interested in understanding what was going on. They were just following orders from the reception, a decision based not on reason but on prejudice. David slowly took a breath, keeping his voice calm as he replied, "I'm not going anywhere. I have the right to be here." The guards exchanged glances, one furrowing his brow while the other raised an eyebrow, squinting as he responded coldly, "If you don't leave voluntarily, we will have to use force." Hearing this, David's gaze sharpened, and he knew this was the final line. The guards didn't wait any longer, moving towards him immediately. One of them grabbed David's elbow, pulling him forcefully. David's arm stiffened for a moment, his eyes fixed on the guard's hand. That action was the breaking point. David jerked his arm free, making the guard step back in surprise. David stood tall, his expression calm but his voice carrying weight. "It seems you don't know who you're dealing with." The guards froze for a moment, exchanging bewildered looks. One of them curled his lip into a mocking grin and asked provocatively, "And who might you be?" David slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and took out his identification, holding it up for them to see. The documents clearly showed that he was the owner of the hotel and of an entire chain of hotels. Jake, Emily, and the two guards stood motionless, their faces blank with shock. The expressions on their faces changed instantly, from arrogance and disdain to confusion and fear. Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry as he realized the severity of the mistake he had just made. "This is a joke, right?" Emily whispered, her voice small and weak, her eyes glued to David's identification. She squinted, studying it closely as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. But David's gaze remained unwavering, steady and firm, making it clear to Emily that the situation had spiraled out of her and Jake's control. David tucked the documents back into his pocket, his eyes never leaving Jake. He spoke slowly, his voice firm. "You just tried to throw the hotel owner out because you judged me based on my appearance." Jake swallowed hard, his gaze flickering over David before shifting to the floor, his hands trembling as they rested on the reception counter. David tilted his head slightly, his voice still steady but filled with authority. "You didn't even bother to check my reservation. You didn't think I could be someone important. All you saw was my appearance." The atmosphere in the hotel lobby suddenly grew heavy, as if all sound had been sucked into silence. The two security guards exchanged glances, but remained speechless. Jake stood frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the counter, his shoulders slumping. He tried to find words to justify himself, but only a stammered murmur escaped his throat. We didn't know." Emily, standing nearby, clasped her hands tightly, taking a step forward and then back again, unsure of what to do. Her eyes seemed lost, unfocused, bewildered. David kept his gaze fixed on them, his eyes cold and resolute. He knew this was a pivotal moment, not just for himself but for the entire system that had allowed such behavior to occur. The tension in the lobby was almost unbearable in its silence. Jake, Emily, and the two security guards stood like statues, their eyes cast downward, clueless on how to handle the situation. Their faces flushed with embarrassment, mouths agape but unable to form words. David did not rush. His eyes remained locked on them, his gaze heavy, pressing down on their shoulders, making all their confidence and arrogance dissolve in an instant. He raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly toward them, and spoke in a calm yet weighty voice. "You didn't know, did you? Do you need to know who I am just to show basic respect?" Emily and Jake stood still, as if paralyzed, their eyes briefly closing, their throats dry, unable to speak. They realized that all their actions had not been driven by protocol, but by the biases they themselves had created. David remained silent, saying nothing more. He understood that they had recognized their mistake. Now, handling the consequences was the management's responsibility. The two security guards exchanged glances and began to slowly step back, trying to avoid attention. They hoped their role in the incident would be forgotten. But David turned his head, eyes fixed on them. "Do you think you have the right to decide who can stay here based solely on their appearance?" The security guards stood still, their hands clenched at their sides, their faces stiff, not knowing what to say. They knew well that every action they had taken was now under scrutiny. A few minutes later, the hotel manager entered the lobby, his face tense. He quickly approached David, his hands clenched tightly, bowing slightly. "Mr. Parker, I sincerely apologize for this incident. I can't believe something like this happened at our hotel." His voice trembled, full of panic and shame, his eyes desperately seeking forgiveness from David. David looked straight into the manager's eyes, his gaze unwavering, his voice firm but calm. "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for change." The manager flinched slightly, then nodded, his shoulders relaxing a bit, his eyes showing an understanding that this was not just an isolated incident, but a symptom of a deeper issue that needed immediate resolution. David gestured toward the surrounding staff, his hand clenching into a fist before releasing, and he continued. "You need to reassess how your staff is trained and how they operate. I will not tolerate anyone being treated like this in my hotel. This is not the first instance of bias, and if policies aren't changed, it certainly won't be the last." The manager lowered his head, letting out a long sigh, his voice quieter. We will review all procedures and conduct special training for the staff. This will never happen again. David nodded slightly, but his gaze remained distant. He knew that words were just one part of the equation. Action and real change were a different story. He looked around the lobby, his eyes sharp, thinking that this incident needed to serve as a lesson, not only for those standing there but for the entire system that allowed such behavior to persist. After the meeting with the manager, David left the lobby, heading towards the lounge area and sat down in a chair. His shoulders began to relax, his hands resting on his knees, fingers tapping gently on the fabric of his trousers. He knew that this incident was only the tip of the iceberg, and the prejudice he faced didn't end here. It was deeply rooted in society. He remembered conversations with his father, when his father would place a reassuring hand on his shoulder and say, "Don't be afraid to hold your head high and fight for what's right." Those words were clearer now than ever, echoing in his mind as if they were being spoken to him at that very moment. David pulled out his phone from his pocket and dialed his wife, Sarah. He heard the ringing tone, and in that instant, his hand around the phone tightened slightly. When she answered, he could hear the concern in her voice. "Are you okay? I knew today wasn't just about checking on the hotel, was it?" David straightened up, his other hand brushing his forehead as he began recounting what had happened. Sarah listened in silence, with an occasional soft sigh on the other end of the line. "I knew you'd eventually face something like this," Sarah said, her voice softening. "But I'm proud of you for not accepting it and deciding to change the situation." David smiled faintly, his eyes softening as well. He leaned back in his seat, feeling a sense of relief spreading within. Family had always been his firm foundation, providing him the strength to continue standing tall. "You've always said you wanted to create a place where others wouldn't have to face what you went through. That's been your plan from the beginning, not just to succeed, but to use that success to change the world around you," Sarah continued, her voice filled with pride. David nodded, his eyes closing for a moment. He knew that it was the support of his family that gave him the strength to move forward, even when the system seemed too rigid and unchangeable. David opened his eyes, looking around the lounge. He knew that his actions today would have an impact on the staff and their attitude towards guests. His hands clenched briefly before relaxing. He knew that he wasn't just exposing prejudice, but also providing a lesson about fairness and respect. After the call with Sarah, he put the phone down and thought about the community he grew up in. His family and friends had always been there for him, supporting each step on his journey to success. David reminded himself that many people face discrimination without having the resources or opportunities he had. This realization strengthened his resolve to use his position to fight for those who could not defend themselves. He placed his hand on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, reminding himself that this incident was just one of countless challenges ahead. Family and community would always be his foundation in the fight for justice and equality. David knew there were still many obstacles to overcome, but today, he felt a greater sense of responsibility than ever before, to continue pushing for change in a system where prejudice had become the norm. David stood up from the chair, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The entire situation forced him to think beyond his personal experience. He squinted slightly, his eyes lingering in the corners of the room. This incident was like a symbol of the injustice that so many Black people face every day, whether in hotels, workplaces, or public spaces. David ran his hand gently over his chin, recognizing that his goal was not just to punish those who had done wrong, but to change the entire system. He noticed Emily and Jake exchanging glances, Jake's hands clenched, while Emily's shoulders sagged, her nervousness evident. David walked toward them, his steps firm, his eyes fixed on them. "This wasn't just a mistake. You acted based on your own biases." David spoke slowly, his voice not loud, but each word seemed to weigh heavily in the air. Emily took a deep breath, her head nodding slightly, while Jake bit his lip, his face flushing with embarrassment. David knew that change wouldn't happen instantly, but he also knew that this lesson was necessary for both of them. David turned back, walking towards the hotel manager who was standing nearby, his steps slow but steady. He stopped in front of him, his eyes sharp, his voice determined. I want this place to become an example for other hotels. Training the staff is not enough. You need to build a culture where situations like this cannot happen. I will be watching to see that change." The manager nodded, his eyes slightly evasive as he looked down at the floor, his hand nervously smoothing his tie. He realized that this was not just an isolated incident. It was not only about his reputation as a manager, but also about the future of the hotel itself. David stood tall, his chest expanding as he took a deep breath. He understood that his mission did not end with resolving this particular incident. This moment had to serve as an example of how to treat customers, regardless of appearance or social status. He knew there were still many challenges ahead, but he also knew that taking this first step was crucial. It was not enough just to make people think about change. The system that allowed such injustices needed to be transformed. David walked out of the hotel lobby, his footsteps solid on the cool tile, his head held high. He knew this wasn't just a personal victory. Each small step, each confrontation like this one, brought him closer to his ultimate goal, creating a world where respect and dignity are fundamental principles for everyone, regardless of skin color. He stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the crisp air. Today was a powerful reminder that the fight for justice was long and challenging, but with the support of family, community, and his own determination, David knew he could achieve the changes that so many others needed as well. David kept walking, his eyes fixed forward. He knew this was not the end, but just the beginning of a much larger journey toward justice and equality. David Parker has shown us the importance of never ceasing to fight for justice and equality. His story is not simply about confronting injustice at a hotel. It symbolizes a larger struggle, building a society where everyone is respected, regardless of their skin color or status. What do you think about what David did and the journey he's on? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice can help change the thoughts and actions of many others. If you find this story meaningful, please share it with your friends and family. Each share can create waves of change, bringing fairness and respect to everyone. Thank you for listening and standing alongside David on this journey. Let's stand up together, step by step, to create a fairer world where everyone has value and is heard. We can change, starting with ourselves, with small actions today.